Morning, everyone, and I'm delighted to meet all of you and to discover the Beit Midrash as a really interesting model for, as we were talking about, for 21st century American Jewish life. You're creating a really interesting and important experiment here, and I'm really delighted to be with all of you and be part of this. So as Rav Shmuley noted, I'll be speaking about this moment in relation to Holocaust memory, Holocaust consciousness, and in light of Thursday being Yom HaShoah, to really try to unpack some of the deeper psychological layers that are playing out now in the discourse around Israel as filtered through the Shoah. And I think it's fair to say that the Holocaust is having a moment. And it's having a moment both in terms of our internal Jewish discourse about October 7th and the way our enemies are critiquing Israel and our response to October 7th as also using Holocaust language, but of course in reverse. And where we are seeing ourselves in some sense as thrown back into the framework of victimhood, our enemies are seeing us as the victimizers and even as the new Nazis. That language has now become mainstream in anti-Zionist circles. Whatever reticence or shame there was before October 7th in invoking the genocide Holocaust comparison to Israel is basically gone. It's now become normative. And so I'd like to unpack both how that discourse on the Shoah is playing internally within Jewish discourse and looking at how our enemies are using the Shoah against us. So the way that this plays out in our internal language is, first of all, how we describe October 7th. October 7th was the day in which a single largest number of Jews were killed since the Holocaust. That's the normative way in which Jews describe October 7th. And October 7th reawakened what I would argue are the three great lingering psychological traumas of the Shoah for Jews. The first, of course, was a feeling of total helplessness. And on October 7th, we had a momentary lapse into helplessness. And as we discussed last night, Israel is a country that famously rescues Jews from around the world. We rescued 100 hostages at Entebbe in 1976. We rescued thousands of Ethiopian Jews during the Civil War in Addis Ababa in 1991. We sent the Israeli Air Force into Addis to pull out 14,000 Jews, and yet we couldn't save 1,000 Jews within our own sovereign borders. And so there was this feeling of total breakdown in the Zionist promise of protecting the Jewish people, and that crisis. That's I would say the first psychological ground that has led to this eruption of Holocaust imagery and association with October 7th. The second psychological button that October 7th pushed in relation to the Holocaust was the acute feeling of Jewish aloneness. The Shoah played out over a 12-year period, beginning with exclusion from German society, and then culminating in the Shoah itself, in genocide. And almost nothing was done in the international community to stop this. So almost all the different stages of this unfolding were known in real time. And yet not until 1944 were some half-hearted measures taken to try to mitigate the process. And so in our collective consciousness, one of the most painful lingering memories is the sense of having been alone and abandoned. And the final psychological impact of the Shoah on our consciousness was the fact that we were struggling for the right to exist, that what was called into question for the first time in the history of anti-Semitism was not what the Jews do, but who the Jews are. In other words, in the past, there was always an escape clause, right? There was a get out of jail free card. You could convert to Christianity, you could leave Judaism and become a Marxist. There was always a way to get out of this. And in the Shoah, there was, for the first time, just being born a Jew was a death sentence. So the idea of the criminalization of Jewish existence, the right to exist being rescinded, is in some ways the deepest trauma of the Shoah. And all three, I would argue that all three of these psychological layers, these residues of trauma, were reactivated on October 7th. And let's play it out briefly. First of all, as I mentioned a moment ago, the sense of helplessness of the Shoah being repeated on October 7th, and the even deeper shock of this happening within a sovereign Jewish state, not in Poland or Iraq, but in the state of Israel. The sense of aloneness that Jews experienced and continue to experience after the Shoah is actually playing out now in the last few days with the death of the Pope. And so Jews don't know what to say, because on the one hand, this Pope was friendly to Jews. On the other hand, many of us have a deep sense of having been betrayed by the Pope after October 7th. And his statements on Israel became increasingly worse. And he really fed the lynch mob against Israel. And I just saw that the Israeli Foreign Ministry, which had issued a statement of mourning for the Pope's passing, just removed the statement from its website, which I think is such an unbelievably stupid thing to do. But it's this government, and there's not much more to say about it. But it's very indicative of how Jews feel that even our friends don't understand us, many of our friends. And I would say that Pope Francis was a friend of the Jewish people until October 8th, until we started hitting back against Hamas. And in terms of the sense of having to defend the legitimacy of our existence, what October 7th unleashed, of course, is a war against the legitimacy of a Jewish state, the right to exist, that terrible phrase. I don't remember if I mentioned this last night, but I met with a group of German journalists. Did I talk about this? Someone, this was in Jerusalem a couple of years ago, and someone said to me, in Germany, we're very pro-Israel. We support your right to exist. And I said, well, in Israel, we're very pro-German. We support your right to exist. And of course, there was nervous laughter in the room as people realized that maybe they're setting the bar for being pro-Israel a little too low. And nothing offends me more than having to defend our right to exist after the Shoah. And the victory of anti-Zionism is to have made this normative. It's normal. Yes, of course, Israel's right to exist is being challenged. The only country in the world whose right to exist is not a given. And so October 7th, of course, immeasurably intensified the assault on our right to exist. And so For me, again, the greatest outrage is that anti-Semitism has not only survived the Holocaust, but is thriving. And sometimes I think that there are two miracles related to the survival of the Jewish people. One is our survival for 4,000 years, and the other is the survival of anti-Semitism, which is also a kind of miracle. How did anti-Semitism manage to survive and reinvent itself after the Shoah to the point where it is now morally acceptable? And anti-Semitism, under the guise of anti-Zionism, has this sense of moral self-confidence, which is extraordinary 80 years after the Shoah. So these are, I think, some of the psychological background that explains the eruption of Holocaust associations for Jewish discourse, and why we really see ourselves once again as a victim people. And I would argue that lapsing into the identity of victimhood is not productive for the Jewish people. And yes, it's true that on October 7th, we had a momentary lapse into victimhood for one day. On October 8th, we already began to turn that around. And you can't look at the devastation in Gaza, which I regard as an inevitable consequence of October 7th. I don't apologize for that devastation. But nevertheless, you can't look at the ruins of Gaza. Large parts of Gaza look like Berlin 1945. A victim people cannot inflict that level of devastation. A victim people could not have attacked Iran and Lebanon and Syria and Gaza simultaneously and beat back the assault of October 7th. And that is something that I feel grateful for. I have no ambivalence about our power. But the fact that we have that power denies us the comforting identity of victimhood. And there is something comforting about being a victim, because if you're a victim, you're unconditionally on the side of the good. And what makes this moment more complicated, what Jewish power has complicated for us, is that in the past, when we were hated, there was no basis whatsoever for the accusations against us. We knew that we didn't use the blood of Christian children to bake matzah. We knew we hadn't crucified Jesus. We knew that these accusations were ludicrous. Today, there are thousands of dead children in Gaza whom our army inadvertently, that's the key word here, but nevertheless, inadvertently killed. And so when we are accused of being child killers, well, it's more complicated than that. Yes, there are dead children as a consequence of war. That happens in every war, but we did kill children. We are killing children. And so the fact that power complicates one's relationship to victimhood, power denies you the right to claim victimhood, which I consider to be a very reasonable trade-off for the Jewish people. I will happily give up the identity of victim in order to have power, in order to be able to defend ourselves against an October 7th. Nevertheless, there are consequences to power. And one of those consequences is we cannot see ourselves in 2025 as a victim people. And so if you look at how this war is being framed, we either see ourselves as the victims, or our enemies see us as the victimizers, as if those are the only two options that we have. And I would argue that neither of those identities are useful categories for understanding Israel's predicament. On the one hand, as I've just tried to lay out, we are not the victims of this story, even though we were on October 7th. And on the other hand, we're not the victimizers. We are acting the way any people in our place would have responded to October 7th, at the minimum, at the minimum. And the fact that we didn't do what Trump suggested we should do, which is expel all the Palestinians, basically, from Gaza, that we didn't do that after October 7th, already places Israel in a different category in the way many other countries might have responded in our place. So we're not victims, we're not victimizers. And I think that that's an important distinction for how we should relate to our collective identity in the post-October 7th reality. I much prefer the word vulnerability to describe Israel's situation to victimhood. Israel is vulnerable. We are very powerful, but power and vulnerability can go together. And we learned on October 7th just how vulnerable we are. And if, God forbid, Iran gets a nuclear weapon, then we will be still more vulnerable. But vulnerability is not victimhood, especially when you have the means to respond to your vulnerability. In understandably falling back into a victim identity, we inadvertently undermine the post-Holocaust Jewish success story. And the great achievement, and we discussed this, Shmuley and I, last night, the great achievement of the Jewish people, the unprecedented achievement in the post-Holocaust era, was to move from the lowest point in Jewish history to the peak point of power, prestige, centrality on the world stage. We have never been more powerful or important than we are today. Not always in good ways. Centrality on the world stage plays both ways. Nevertheless, we made that extraordinary and unprecedented transition from total powerlessness, from the abyss, to the peak of Jewish power and success, both in Israel and in the diaspora generally, and especially in North America. And we need to own that success. And by lapsing into the identity of victimhood, we undermine what I consider to be the greatest achievement of survival in Jewish history, which is not only to endure, but in a sense to reverse the destruction into a kind of redemption. And so for me, I much prefer the formulation of October 7th as the greatest number of Jews who have been killed in 100 years of the Arab-Israeli conflict. That's enough to emphasize just how serious October 7th was. We never had an experience, including in the 1948 war, when we were really fighting on a daily basis for our lives. We never had an experience where 24 Jewish communities were taken over and burned. We never had that experience. And so I don't need the Holocaust as my frame of reference to describe what happened on October 7th. I don't need pogroms. Yes, Hamas is Nazi-like, but we are not those Jews of the past. And that's really the crucial distinction. So that's the ledger on the Jewish side. That's how the Holocaust is playing out on our side. On the side of our enemies, the Holocaust has also become central. And one of the things that I've noticed, this pattern that's playing out in anti-Zionist discourse and how they're critiquing the Gaza war, is the different ways in which the suffix CIDE, genocide, CIDE, is playing out in accusations against Israel. So, for example, there was recently an accusation against Israel from some of the human rights NGOs that we are committing domicide. What is domicide? An invented word for Israel. Domicide is genocide against homes, domiciles. Israel is committing domicide by mass destruction of Gaza neighborhoods. The American Association of Historians recently voted to condemn Israel for scholasticide. What is scholasticide? I'm not sure. But what I think they mean is that because we declared total war against Hamas, it made it impossible for the Gaza school system to function. So we are committing war against the schools. And we occasionally bomb schools, which we do when Hamas is sitting in empty schools that they have turned into bases of operations. So yes, we have bombed schools as well. So that adds up to scholasticide. Now, why this obsession with attaching the suffix CIDE to Israel's actions? I think it's pretty transparent. And whether it's conscious or not, the goal is to take the Holocaust away from us. And the Holocaust has provided, at least for Jews in the West, has provided a certain measure of immunity in the past against extreme forms of anti-Semitism, against violent anti-Semitism, and even against anti-Zionism. And so the campaign now is to remove the protection of the Holocaust from the Jewish people. And I think there's also a move here that has resonance unconsciously, but resonance with the old Christian supersessionism. Supersessionism was once central to Christian doctrine. And the premise of supersessionism was that the church has superseded the Jewish people as the real Israel. We are the old and lapsed Israel, and the church became the new and real Israel. And what supersessionism did was remove the Jews from our own story. The Bible, the Hebrew Bible, became part of the Christian Bible. It wasn't our story anymore. We were not reading our own story correctly. The Christians were reading the Hebrew Bible correctly. And so this, to my mind, the anti-Zionist assault on the Holocaust is, and on Zionism generally, is a kind of political version of supersessionism. It is removing the Jews from our own story. We don't own the Holocaust anymore. The Holocaust has now shifted to the other side. The Palestinians own the Holocaust. The Gaza Strip is the Gaza ghetto, evoking the Warsaw Ghetto. Israel's war against Hamas is not a war against radical Islamism. It's a war of annihilation against the Palestinian people. It's another Holocaust. And so political supersessionism tries, first of all, to deny us our own relationship to the land of Israel, our national story. And it now is trying to deny us the Holocaust. We don't belong in any part of our story anymore. The other transparent attempt here, I think, is to even the score in some way. That the West has been carrying this deep guilt since the 1940s. And if you can prove that the Jews are the new Nazis, then somehow again, this is all playing out, I think, unconsciously, but on some level, it means that the Holocaust wasn't as severe an event as we've pretended it is. Because ultimately, any people that gets power has a go at being Nazis. And now it's the Jews' turn. And so if we're Nazis now, well, Europe's sins of 80 years ago is somehow, if not completely erased, at least put into some perspective. So these are, I think, the very complicated psychological dimensions of how the Holocaust is playing out today. The last point that I'll say, two last points. There's always a last point. One is the failure of Holocaust education. And what October 7th and its aftermath revealed is that there is a colossal failure in Holocaust education whose intention was to protect the Jewish people from another onslaught. And the fact that the Holocaust is now being weaponized against the Jewish people means that something fundamental has not been transmitted through Holocaust education. This is the most Holocaust-educated generation, this generation. And yet, the fact that the way in which they have used the Holocaust is as the most readily available frame of reference for attacking the Gaza war. So there's a major breakdown in Holocaust education, which the Jewish community needs to confront. And I think that one of the main reasons for this breakdown is that Holocaust education has not successfully conveyed the uniqueness of anti-Semitism. It has subsumed anti-Semitism and the Holocaust itself into a general framework of racism. Now, of course, there is an element of racism that was played out in the Holocaust. The Nazis were obviously racist, but they were also drawing on 2,000 years of anti-Semitism, which had nothing to do with racism. And last night, I was asked how I define anti-Semitism, and I'll repeat that definition briefly now, which is that for me, anti-Semitism is turning the Jews into the symbol of whatever a given civilization defines as its worst qualities. Christ killer under Christianity, ultimate capitalist under Marxism, race polluter under Nazism, and today, in the era of universal human rights, the Jewish state is the world's arch criminal, the ultimate violator, the apartheid, ethnic cleansing, genocidal state. And so that's the pattern of how an anti-Semitism in that sense works differently than other forms of hatred for the other. Racism is its own category. And I'm not saying this is worse, this is better, they're different. And you can't combine all forms of hatred, which is really the tendency of Holocaust education in America. Let's all be nice to each other. Let's all be tolerant of each other because look at the Holocaust. Yes, that's one lesson from the Holocaust, but it leaves out for Jews the crucial lesson, which is just as the Holocaust itself was unique, the hatred that made the Holocaust was also unique. And so the last point is, what will we remember? What should Holocaust education emphasize? In 2033, we are going to observe the centenary of the Nazi rise to power. 100 years is a very long time, especially in the contemporary world. 100 years is ancient history. And certainly for my generation, and I think most of you here, the Holocaust was almost a contemporary event. We grew up with it. But that's not true anymore for the generation that's growing up now. And we make the mistake, I think, of emphasizing the Holocaust itself and not telling the story of how the Jewish people overcame the Holocaust, not telling the story of the post-Holocaust era. Because if you leave out the Jewish success story of the post-Holocaust era, you're not telling the story of the Jewish reclamation of power. You're not telling the story of Zionism. You're telling the story of Jewish victimhood. And so now we're the victimizers, and that's a story that's taking very deep root, and we have to reclaim the Holocaust. And so Shmuley had mentioned the book that I'm working on, which is really trying to do that. And so let's open up for conversation.
I think there's going to be I would add, I think we kind of looked up. We're talking about what's been happening to Jews in Israel. But I would say this is an intentional part of the war. Hamas wants the Gazans to be killed, the children to be killed, the school to be bombed, because they're trying to turn the campus activities. These manuals appeared telling them how to do it. I think we need to put it, what's going on and what you're saying in terms, this is part of the war between Israel and Hamas. And we need to do a better job of revealing.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Focus. It's not just that.
Right. I mean, there's a whole other talk that needs to be given about how we should be responding to the assault against the legitimacy of our story. But I'm happy to have that conversation, but that's a separate issue. Yeah.
You talked about October 6th, October 7th, and October 8th. I want to talk
Last night.
Yeah.
Right.
And a little bit today.
Mhm.
I want to talk about or get your views on what happened before October 6th. And I think those questions.
Right.
How did this happen?
Mm-hmm.
And I know in the fog of war, we're not going to investigate why this happened in great detail.
Well, we should, but this government refuses to.
Especially with our current government.
Yeah.
Will it ever happen? Why for years did Hamas be able to get all of these materials for weapons and build this with the vaunted Israeli intelligence not being able to detect that? For years, this didn't happen overnight.
Right.
They were training. How could this happen? So that's a question that needs to be answered. You mentioned the Pope. I think the Pope, his statements, as far as I know, unless you know something different, I don't think he's critical of Israel. He says, as all popes would say, there should be a ceasefire. As many Israelis are saying right now, there should be a ceasefire. Maybe the Pope says to stop killing Palestinians and especially Palestinian Christians. But why? And the Israelis are to get the hostages back.
Mm-hmm.
That's their motive for the ceasefire. I haven't heard him being critical directly of Israel. And I think the Pope has been a good friend in many ways, as best as a Pope can be. You mentioned victim and victimizer as the only choices. I think you can be both. We clearly were the victim on October 7th. And in many ways, I think we're the victimizers now. When we kill, as a result of whatever we're doing, 50,000 plus Palestinians, if that's a correct figure. I know there's all this debate about who's reporting it, but if that's true, we are the victimizers. Now, I know we're doing something to try to eliminate Hamas, but in so doing, we are killing many, I think, innocent Palestinians. Finally,
Wait, slow down. Let me answer. I'm not going to remember. Then we'll get to your last question. I'll start from the end because that's what I remember. What I tried to say is that the polarity of either victim or victimizer is false. And that when Jews see ourselves as victims and our enemies see us as victimizers, neither of those categories are useful for explaining what Israel is doing. And we are, I believe, acting the way any people in our place would act and fighting a very brutal war under very brutal conditions. But that doesn't make us either victims or victimizers. It makes us a vulnerable people that's using power. And when you use power, especially under these circumstances, much of it will be justified. Some of it will not be. That's how power plays out. And you mentioned the figure 50,000, and my response is 50,000 who? 50,000 who? The figure that we see constantly in the media is Israel has killed 50,000 Palestinians in this war. 50,000 which Palestinians? Now, Israel says we have killed at least 20,000 combatants. Now, I don't know if that's accurate. I don't know if the Hamas figures are accurate, but let's assume I'll accept the 50,000, but you also have to accept the 20,000. And I had an interview a few months ago with a reporter who was talking about the 50,000. I said, well, yes, okay, 50,000. The IDF says we've killed 20,000 combatants. He says, well, the IDF says. And I said, oh, well, Hamas says 50, and that's fine. He says, well, the UN accepts those figures. So, go argue. So if those figures of Hamas and the IDF are reasonably accurate, then the ratio of combatants to civilians that we have killed in this war is well within the norm of asymmetrical wars of the 21st century. And there are some who say that, including military figures around the world, that Israel's ratio is much better than other wars. Now, I'm a little bit uncomfortable with that language because you end up sounding like an accountant of death. But if you're being accused of genocide, you have no choice but to say, well, wait a minute, let's look at the proportions. Those kinds of proportions, 2-to-1 or less than 2-to-1 of civilians to combatants, is not genocide.
I agree with
It's not even an especially brutal asymmetrical war. And so we have to really be careful when we throw these figures around. And
But
so
it's
that's
the reality of what the world sees.
it's
every day.
it's a reality.
And it's the reality that the world is turning against us.
Yes,
Because
okay.
of those figures.
Okay.
Because of that.
Yes, of course. Now you mentioned the Pope. I don't remember what he said, but I remember reading statements by the Pope, which to me went far beyond what I considered to be legitimate criticism and really delegitimizing this war and going very far to adopting the Palestinian narrative and welcoming Palestinian delegations in ways that I found frankly outrageous. And so again, I don't remember the quote, so there's no point in us having this argument because I don't remember, but I do remember the impressions that I had at the time, and I was really, really upset with the Pope. You had one more question before we get to your fourth?
Well, I could go on.
About how did it happen? How did October 7th happen? Now, what's coming out is that military intelligence warned Netanyahu over the last few years that Hamas was diverting the money from Qatar away from humanitarian aid and using it for the tunnels. And Netanyahu did nothing. He kept the money flowing. So Netanyahu, this war, the massacre is on Netanyahu. Now, I don't absolve the army. The army has a tremendous responsibility that it has to answer for. But the first responsibility is to the commander-in-chief, and his policy of deliberately funding Hamas because he wanted to divide the Palestinians, because he wanted to downplay the Palestinian Authority, that blew up in our faces on October 7th. Your last question.
That doesn't explain why how did all these materials for weapons get into Hamas that they've been bombing Israel with?
We allowed it.
Years.
We allowed it.
Yeah.
We allowed it to happen.
Through Southern.
Yes.
My last of many questions. Last night, and with all respect, you said that Israel will be governing in some form in the West Bank for years to decades.
Security.
And I'm saying that's exactly the wrong policy. I think Israel should never govern in any Palestinian territory, whatever you want to call it, ever again. That's the problem. And until we get a two-state solution, I'm going to send you my proposal. Until we get that, there's always going to be conflict. There's always going to be conflict. There's been conflict forever, and it's never going to end.
I agree.
Unless Israel and the Palestinians are totally separate for decades, maybe even centuries, and get the hatred of each other out of their blood forever.
Look, I'm a two-stater. I've always been a two-stater, just about. And when, I don't know if it'll happen. When you say that we need separation, separation is an illusion. And the reason separation is an illusion is because of geography. If you have a Palestinian state in the West Bank, it'll be 500 meters from Ben Gurion Airport, which means any terrorist, even operating separately from a Palestinian government, can bring down planes coming in. And the security concerns of a totally sovereign Palestinian state are unavoidable. And I have never seen a good answer to those security concerns. Maybe your proposal has it. I'll be very interested to read it. So, yeah.
First of all, my wife and I listen to podcasts on a regular basis, and we enjoy it. We enjoy
Thank
the way that your points of view have evolved over the years quite a bit. I was a little disturbed last night when we talked about Mahmoud Khalil, a person whom I certainly probably would not like, and whose viewpoints are reprehensible. But you suggested that this isn't, we Jews shouldn't be involved in his problem where he was renditioned, picked up off the streets and then shipped to Louisiana. And then our beloved president put on X that Shalom Mahmoud, which to my knowledge, Jews in Israel had nothing to do with this. There were demonstrators following his abduction who went in and had shirts that it not in my name. And that's the way I feel about it, that we Jews have a responsibility to fight for justice. And I think just a couple of weeks ago on your podcast, you were praising Israel's due process of law. Well, we need due process of law in this country and Torah values. And our Torah values say, this guy's reprehensible. We can't stand him. But we need to defend he should at least be charged with a crime. And that was my point. That's what just.
No, I really appreciate what you're saying about not in my name. And the problem with my argument is that this is being done in the name of the Jewish community. And so the Jewish community, some in the Jewish community feel the need to respond. I understand that. My problem, though, with how parts of the Jewish left is responding is, first of all, in turning him into this victim, and he is not. He led the mob, and
I think he is a victim. Sorry, I disagree with you.
Okay, so we disagree on that, and the other thing we may disagree about is how vocal Jews should be in defending him. Yes, Jews need to defend civil liberties, but the good news is that this president will give you lots of hills to die on in the coming 4 years. There are going to be really endless opportunities for the Jewish community to take a stand on what Trump is doing to the Venezuelans, take a stand on all kinds of other civil liberties issues. This issue, after the last year and a half of what the Mahmoud Khalils did to your kids, is, to my mind, for all the reasons that you say, still in the end have some measure of discernment and self-protection. And if the neighborhood bully is stepping up and saying, I'm going to put a stop to the mob, I don't like the way he's doing it, and say that. And the ADL said it, and the AJC said it. The AJC had a great statement. It started out by saying Mahmoud Khalil is an enemy of the American Jewish community, and we hope he is deported. At the same time, we expect there to be due process. Beautiful statement. That's enough. I think everyone here just about can remember the American Nazi Party's intention to march in Skokie in 1977. And at the time, I felt that the ACLU was right, that the Nazis should have the right to march in Skokie, as appalling as it is, a neighborhood of Holocaust survivors. But still, you define free speech by its most objectionable expression. And so you defend the right of the Nazis to march. I accepted that. What I did not accept was that it was Jewish lawyers who were taking that position. Why does it have to be you? Let someone else do it. There are lots of non-Jewish lawyers in the civil liberties world, but the Jews, we have to pride ourselves on what wonderful defenders we are of civil liberties, even to the point where you have Jewish lawyers defending the right of Nazis to traumatize Holocaust survivors. Why is that your mission, Mr. Jewish lawyer? I don't know if you're a lawyer or not. I don't mean that. It was not addressed to you personally. Maybe it was addressed to you personally. I don't know whether you took a stand there. But that's my framework, is Skokie. Yes, the Nazis should march. No, the American Jewish community should not be the ones defending their right to march. A little bit of discernment. A little bit of self-protection. Not every issue requires American Jews to rush to the forefront and say, oh, we're going to do everything we can to defend the civil liberties of our enemies. If there's no one else to defend them, go ahead. But from what I see on the streets, I see lots of people out there defending Mahmoud Khalil. He does not need the Forward, the Jewish Daily Forward. He's got, the whole, he's got the New York Times. Yes.
So just one thing, the
Oh,
Shalom Hartman thing is what.
Yeah, no, yes,
What would be over the edge.
you're right. But still, I come out against the not in my name. Still, so that's a fair disagreement. Yes.
You mentioned about the failure of Holocaust education. And Dara Horn wrote an article a couple of years ago just about that, saying that there was a failure of Holocaust education. And it had to do with the fact that it appears that at the end of the Holocaust, that was the end of the Jewish people. Mm-hmm. And it speaks to your point, which, I'd like to hear, is that what your book is about how we rose after the Holocaust, because that's what seems to be the problem. Everybody thinks in these places where Holocaust education, which is mandated in the state of Arizona, in some of these smaller communities, and no Jews in the classroom, no Jews as the teachers, nobody with the history of what actually happened. These kids grow up with it. Well, they're like an extinct people, like the Aztecs.
Or worse, this victim people has now turned into its enemy. It's turned into Nazis. The book that I'm working on is an attempt, first of all, to explain how Jews went from 1945 to power, and it is an attempt to also defend that transition, our reclamation of power, because what's under assault today is the post-Holocaust Jewish recovery. That's what they're really attacking. So that's what my book's about. Yeah.
I'm a child of the 60s. There were two seminal events that really formed my part of our generation. Vietnam War, 67 War. Mm-hmm. A couple of things.
What about the Summer of Love? That was pretty.
That continued. We would turn on the TV at night. Walter Cronkite would come on for 6-7 minutes and show us Vietnam. It wasn't 24/7 with CNN and Fox. And
Right.
this, but that 6 or 7 minutes changed how America saw the war. It was an influencer. And on the Jewish side of the 67 war, this is strictly by happenstance. In 1966, I was president of our local ACA chapter. I got together with the girls from
Of your local,
ACA
ACA.
chapter, now BBYO.
I remember
Back
them,
then,
right,
ACA.
right.
Got together with the BBG president in our little town. We created a one-question survey that we took to our region, which went to the district, which went national in 1966. Are you an American Jew or a Jewish American?
Mhm.
Came back almost 80-20. We were American Jews.
Mhm.
We ran that same survey a year later after the 67 war. It was 90-10, the other direction. What I think we have not learned is how to monopolize and how to take advantage of publicity.
Mhm.
I mean, these are events that were outside of our control,
Yeah.
but certainly had an impact on how not just we as kids at that point saw it, but how the world saw us.
Mhm.
We had an opportunity here back on October 7th to really take that up, that the crux of that issue and show the world it's not just the Palestinians, it's not just Hamas. This is an epidemic, and we missed it.
We did miss it.
We look today, Putin bombs civilian locations all the time. Nobody says anything. Again, I think we're missing an opportunity.
Mhm.
And, I'm not smart enough to, I'm not a marketer. I'm not smart enough to know how this gets done. But I think there's people here that know how to capitalize and should be capitalizing on this opportunity.
Yeah, when people ask me, when I speak to American Jewish audiences, why isn't Israel doing a better job explaining itself? And my answer is very simply, we never did a good job explaining ourselves, even when we had reasonable governments. With this government, there's not a chance for us to reasonably explain ourselves. But American Jewish organizations should be doing a much better job because you know your own culture. We don't. And even for me, I grew up here, but I've lived much more of my life in Israel than here, and I don't really know the culture anymore. I'm finding it more and more difficult to speak to young people. I do campus tours. It's not the same anymore. I don't have that same shared language, but you do. And the answers need to come. Unfortunately, Israel's not going to provide those answers. It has to come from here. So I take your question and I move it forward to the American Jewish community. But it's the right question. Yes.
So I'm gonna go back to the Holocaust and lack of education and all of that kind of stuff. I remember where Jewish organizations started saying that we need to move past the Holocaust because our children are seeing us as victims. And Holocaust education was discussed.
Mhm.
My son is 53 years old and it was being discussed, but then the leaders of the organization started saying, our kids need to see us more than Holocaust survivors and victims. They need to see us as a thriving and growing community and all that kind of stuff. And that's when we moved away from Holocaust. Hebrew schools were not teaching it. Religious schools were discussing it somewhat, but it became such a thing that I don't want my kids to be going to USY and talk constantly about the Holocaust, that
Right.
we are the Holocaust and that's what we do and that kind of thing. And that was our doing. It wasn't the culture around us. We basically wanted to start seeing us. I was in Israel, I came to Israel in 1956. And the people there were by and large Holocaust survivors that came after 1945, 48 and all of those years. They didn't want to talk about the Holocaust. So we left all of that behind us and we started moving on, and that's why we became successful. because we decided that we
Yeah.
needed to live,
Right.
not be Holocaust victims. And I'm sure that's probably in your book, that
Very much
we just
so.
moved on.
Very much
And
so.
now we are paying the price for it, and I'm not sure if there is a way for us to go to teach Holocaust again at this stage when Israel is in the state that it's at as being the powerhouse.
Well, it's very interesting because when we were all growing up, the Holocaust was generally not taught. It wasn't discussed. It wasn't, there weren't films, hardly any. You had a couple of documentaries maybe in the 60s, but the understandable response of the Jewish community, and this began really especially after 67, was to compensate for that silence, and to really try to push Holocaust education. But I think we're at another one of those moments where we need to reevaluate, and I think we need to be focusing more on the Jewish people as a survivor people and not as a victim people. And a survivor people is not just a people that goes through trauma, but that overcomes it. And that's the story I think that we have to tell more and more. So, yeah.
So, to talking about, the message is not getting out there. This past summer, we went to Abilene, Kansas, to the Eisenhower Library, Presidential Library. And, there was that famous picture of, President Eisenhower and the journalists, going through the camps. And the commentary underneath the picture was Eisenhower viewing political prisoners. Nowhere was the word Jewish prisoners mentioned at all. And that was so disturbing to me, that talking about, we're out of the story, we're not part of the story. Similar thing happened when we went to see Auschwitz quite a few years ago. And the guide was a Polish person, and the victims were the Polish people by the Nazi Germans. And
How long ago was that?
it was quite a while ago. It was just the year that the museum in Warsaw opened. So was that 2014 maybe? So 11.
Oh, and so that's fairly recent.
Uh-huh, yeah. And it was, so there have been other times when it's not our story. We don't
Yeah,
exist
Yeah,
anymore.
yeah,
Very disturbing.
Well, it's interesting about Auschwitz because it depends what you mean by Auschwitz. There was Auschwitz I and Auschwitz II. Auschwitz II is Birkenau. Birkenau is where the final solution happened. Auschwitz I was not technically a death camp, it was a concentration camp. And there, the Jews, we had a very strong presence there, but we were not actually the majority in Auschwitz I. And where the tourists tend to go is Auschwitz I. And so, well, Jews go to Birkenau, but most of the non-Jewish visitors to Auschwitz don't make it to Birkenau. It's 2 kilometers away. And Auschwitz I is really the museum, and that's where you have the tour guides. And that's a real problem in telling this story. There was, in terms of the Eisenhower photo, I think that's becoming more and more typical. There was this unbelievable story just the other week of, well, it was in January when, so it was the other month. January, you have Holocaust Memorial Day in Europe. Europe observes Holocaust Memorial Day when Auschwitz was liberated in January. And you had a report on, was it Sky News? It was a British TV program where this young woman, the newscaster, is telling about commemorations. And she says 6 million people were killed. And then she says 6 million people, along with homosexuals, political prisoners, and Poles. Now, if you're going to spell out who the others are, but 6 million people, generic people, then what's wrong with this picture? And that for me was this extraordinary moment. You can't say the word Jew in certain circles anymore. So we've got a problem, Kansas. That's it.
You alluded to it a little bit last night and today, talk a bit about your views of where the Israeli government is and where it's going and their role, because Jews throughout the world and non-Jews, certainly in the United States, will look to that government as an example of what the country is doing and what Jews do. It's not an example I particularly want, but it is.
Yeah.
But it is so where does that government go from today? The influence of the Haredi in that government, and will we see a truly democratic government again in Israel?
Oh yeah, I'm convinced we will. I mentioned last night that every poll since October 7th shows a strong return of the opposition. There's not one credible poll that I've seen that shows this government being reelected. I think they are so fatally discredited. You have 65 to 70%, depending on the time and the poll, that wants this government out. That's a very solid majority. And so until that happens, we are for now stuck with a government that is the embodiment of the worst traits in the Jewish people. Every people has positive sides and negative sides. This government is the collection of all of the negative traits of the Jewish people throughout history. It has brilliantly collected all of our worst traits, and it is fanatical on religion. It's fanatical on nationalism. It is corrupt. This is the most corrupt government we've ever had, and that's what we have.
What is the timing in terms of
Another year and a half. Oh, and every day is an eternity. Every day. So, yeah.
Yeah, well, I really appreciated your talk last night, and I've listened to some of your podcasts, really enjoyed them. But one thing that really keeps me up at night, and it really bothers me, is what's going on. I'm sure you're familiar with it, since you did say you spoke at Columbia, on U.S. college campuses. I am not surprised at all that there are anti-Semites out there protesting. I was shocked how the presidents of these universities called it, in the name of free speech, they're allowed to do what they were doing. I've said this over and over again to anybody who listens to me, that if one white person stood in the middle of any college campus and said, kill all the blacks, that guy would be deported, arrested, put away for life. And yet not one thing has happened. And these presidents, who a lot of them are Jewish, in the name of free speech, it's all right. How do you reconcile that? That really bothers me.
What was so shocking to me about those three presidents who appeared before Congress and were asked about genocide. These are people who in terms of free speech in relation to attacks on other groups, completely shut down free speech. The prevailing culture on campus was exquisitely sensitive to what they called microaggressions. You didn't have to call for genocide against other groups. All you had to do was use a wrong pronoun to get the campus culture outraged, and yet there was no outrage here. And so what so deeply offended me is that the civil liberties culture that you talked about completely failed the Jews, to protect the Jews. Liberal America, liberal academia failed to protect the Jewish students. The Jews were abandoned for the last year and a half on campus. And I saw it over and over again. I spoke on campuses from Columbia to Berkeley, meeting with Jewish students, and the message over and over again is we're abandoned. There were a few exceptions. At University of Pennsylvania was an exception where they felt the administration was really supporting the Jewish students, protecting them. But generally, Jewish students were abandoned. And so that brings me back to Trump. When you have a bully, a vulgar, obnoxious danger to democracy, I agree with all the descriptions. But this guy steps into the void that liberal America created. And so it's an excruciating dilemma for American Jews. I don't minimize the dilemma, but it is a dilemma. And it shouldn't just be, and I'm coming back to our conversation, it shouldn't just be, well, Jews have a responsibility to defend civil liberties and tikkun olam. And so we have to stand up for Mahmoud Khalil. Not so fast. And that's where I absolutely connect to what you were saying. Yeah. Sorry to use you as a punching bag.
Her generation, my husband's generation, as he mentioned last night in his introductory talk, everything was about Holocaust, Holocaust this, Holocaust that. I grew up hearing it,
Yeah.
That all seems to have changed with October 7th. Nobody talks about the Holocaust. It's now all October 7th. That has changed our story. So for people like myself, who grew up and it was all about the Holocaust, and they're building a beautiful new Holocaust center right here in Phoenix.
Yeah.
Starting here sometime. Where does that leave us?
Yeah.
Because October 7th has taken over.
It's a great question, and Donniel Hartman, my partner in the podcast, noted that October 7th is the new Holocaust in Jewish consciousness. And I don't think it has replaced the Holocaust. I actually think it's brought the Holocaust back in a not useful way. Again, it's seeing ourselves as victims. And so what worries me about a Holocaust museum being created now is what's the story it's going to tell? And that goes back to what we're talking about. What's the story? Is it just or primarily going to tell the story of the destruction? Or will it also tell the extraordinary story, for example, of the displaced persons camps, which is an amazing story. And my book begins with the displaced persons camps.
I'll tell you that there is going to be at least one gallery that's called the Nazi Rise to Power. We're sponsoring that in memory of my mother because she was there at the rise of the Nazi.
Okay, but we also need a gallery that tells the story of how the Jews overcame the Holocaust.
Yes.
What generally happens, I met in Jerusalem just a few weeks ago with a group of Holocaust museum directors from around the world who were in Israel. And what I said to them was, what you tend to do in your museums is you devote almost all the space to the genocide itself, the process, how it began into the 30s and then the 40s. And then when you tell the story of the Jewish resurrection after the Holocaust, you tend to focus, let's say, on a story of a survivor in your local community who became a prominent businessman or successful in other ways. And I said, that's great, but you're not telling the story of the Jewish people. The Holocaust is the story of how the Jewish people was targeted for destruction. The post-Holocaust story is not the story of individual survivors who succeeded. It's the story of how the Jewish people succeeded. And Zionism is an essential part of that story. The American Jewish story is an essential part of that story. You know what? American Jews are now being accused of white privilege. That's not the context in which the American Jewish success story needs to be told. Needs to be told in the context of the last 100 years of Jewish history. And if you tell it in the context of white America, then you reach one conclusion about Jewish success in America. If you tell it in the context of the Jewish story, you reach a very different conclusion. The American Jewish success story, until the last few years, was always celebrated by American society as one of the great examples of America at its best. And now suddenly it's becoming a story of America at its worst. And that as well plays into Israel. Until the last years, Israel was an admirable success story, a story of human perseverance and faith and courage. And now suddenly it's a sordid story. It's a steamy story.
Let me ask you one last question. You talked about the supersessionism in the Christian world. Can you reflect a little bit, assuming you have your finger on the pulse, of where the different denominations of the Christian world are at in the last year and a half? The diversity of Catholics and evangelicals and various Protestant groups, not just in America, but globally,
Yeah.
in terms of how they're engaging with this moment and how kind of it's a huge question, but how the theological and the political intersect in this moment.
Yeah. So I have a very kind of basic sense of how this is playing out in the different denominations. The mainline churches, most of them were lost to Israel already years ago. The Episcopalians were not as bad. There were gradations, right? The Presbyterians were a disaster. The Methodists, kind of iffy. The Episcopalians were iffy. But in the last year and a half, I think we've seen a real deterioration in the mainline churches.
Mainline Protestant.
Liberal Protestants. Yeah. The evangelicals, well, you know better than I do. You're sitting in a I think a strong evangelical center. And on the whole, the older generation of evangelicals very pro-Israel. Among the younger generation, it's not clear yet how it's playing out. And we can't take that support for granted anymore. I think it needs to be nurtured. There should be Jewish evangelical dialogue. And as far as the Catholic Church goes, I think the Pope has set a very bad example in the last year and a half. A very destructive example. Look it up. You did?
I did. There were some statements.
Mhm.
He asked the world, he said, I don't know whether this is genocide or not, but he said there should be, the experts should decide what the word genocide means.
That's not a friend.
Well, okay, but it's
not a friend.
Look, I don't think, well.
Our friends are people who stand up and say, I have a lot of questions about the war.
Okay.
I have a lot of questions about how this war is being conducted. This is not what genocide looks like.
I understand.
That's a friend.
But there are a lot of people, very smart people who define genocide in different ways.
Well, they're not my friends.
Okay, they're your friend.
No, they're not our friends.
But why should the Pope totally be Israel's friend when he's got other constituencies in the world?
So condemn the war. But also make a very clear distinction that the Jewish people is being libeled.
I think the main thing he wants to do is have a ceasefire. That's been
All right.
essence of his marriage.
All right. Okay.
Okay, friends, let's thank, thank you all for